on fashion, fascination and fate. But that is for next time. Thank you so much.
After such an reflective and thoughtful lecture, it's difficult to say anything, but nevertheless, I have been instructed by the organizers that I have to say something. So after listening to you, and I think it's something which we'll think about and perhaps interpret over and over again. But listening to the question and before that to what Professor Guru just said, a few things I'm going to begin with when I hear him again and or we have occasion to discuss what he has spoken about today. I think the first thing is that password is for him a concept. So it should not be reduced to what we actually do every day. Whether it is in terms of recovering my identity, no, I can take on a false identity. No, I can call myself waterfall and create a password. So don't take that literally, how many times I change or whatever. It's a concept. It's a concept which is asking me to think about how do I think I gain legitimacy and access to something which then becomes authoritative or is taken, as it were, seriously. So that is the line, that's the question I'm asking, and that's the question which makes me think about our practices as an individual scholar, as a collective group, as an institution. What are the things I do or I seek out, whether it is in terms of, he talked about who's quoting whom or who's not quoting whom, etc. These are things which are, as it were, ways in which we are saying how do they make, have access to something or legitimize themselves. And there could be many reasons, many judgments about that. But at the end of the day, that's not what scholarship or what a scholar or their activity or an intellectual password should be all about. And that should not be the path you should be following. What I should realize instead is, and that's his call, I think basically is saying what we need to do is to think in terms of what he called thinking afresh. And that word afresh has to be thought about many times, because it's not that each of us are going to be so new and so different that it will never be like any other person. It will also not be something which only stems and makes sense from my experience and makes sense only to me. That's also not afresh, because it has to reach out and make sense to others. So your starting point could be imagination, intuition, experience, but it must then actually reveal to others an aspect of reality that was otherwise perhaps not so visible. That we are calling truth. At least some aspect of truth is about being able to show to the others that there is this dimension that needs also to be considered and thought about, which we hadn't thought about. And that's in some sense what theory is doing. So what you do is, you don't begin with a clean slate, whether it is experience, whether it is available theoretical frameworks, whether it is a concept. All these are various ways in which, and wherever they have come from, multiple sources, that's your starting point. But to use his phrase, all these concepts and theories, no matter how exciting and enticing actually they are, they remain dull. By which I take him to imply that they appear very often, if we reflect on it seriously, inadequate for making sense of our own world, our own lives, our own experience of the society and the time in which we are living, historical time in which we are living. So, in that sense, you have to push them. You may have to set them aside. You may have to nuance them, but you will need to return back to something like that. You will reformulate, reconceptualize, etc. So when we think in terms of various perspectives, if we end with perspectives, this is the problem. You are not really saying, am I showing this element, something which others can also regard to be in what I call truth, something that makes sense to them and which you cannot just push away. And when Professor Gopal Guru asked us to think about bringing back the normative in theory, I thought he was addressing your question, the historian's question in many ways. Because when you're bringing back the normative, you're asking the different perspective that came up in the debate on Sati. You mentioned Ashish Gandhi. How are you thinking in terms of human life and human being? That's the normative question you're asking them to think about, not saying is this perspective right or not. And I think Professor Guru is asking us to actually bring in the normative by asking those fundamental moral and ethical questions and see what your perspective and your theory and your analysis reveals to us about that particular direction. And that's what theory is all about, that at the end of it, that's what we want to do. And in some sense, it's not being you need the concept, but you're not going to be enslaved by it. And that's what, that rather interesting phrase you use, not to be consumed, not to be taken over by it, that you simply regard this as your password or key to everything that is going to be noble and heroic and I don't know, make you famous or whatever else it might be. So I think, but there is this, in that sense, continuous movement back and forth where you begin with what is given to you and through the entire thing. And I think when you use the Rawlsian example, it's exactly this, this is the concept with which we are beginning and we are starting to think and maybe begin our discussion. We could begin somewhere else, but these are historically conditioned situations because of which we are beginning here and with Rawls, but our experience and our thinking about our world will pose questions to it and ask you to see, which he does in the book that is just out, really why is that theory of justice or the available theories of justice failing to answer our predicaments and our questions? Why do they remain unfinished, incomplete, inadequate? So how do we think in terms of adequacy, etc., etc.? On the question of above, lack of something is a way of getting closer to, because what is always something which is in flux, which is changing, which is so contextual, that perhaps in our context we can actually think in terms of starting with what it is not. But it's a way again of, because if you were to think in terms of what is progress, you will have a few indicators placed there. Maybe, I don't know, great irrigation schemes, science, tech, etc. But when you say what it is not, you're going to say what all the other attributes which have been pushed outside of the discourse, which are not included, which are actually bracketed out, in terms of which now you can understand, is this, you can ask the question which he wants you to ask, is this progress? And in terms of those normative concerns, then you will ask, can we call all these elements sufficient for thinking about progress? And maybe your theory will push you forward and much more, of course, than this to think about. I have many other things about this notion of other that he mentioned, which is so essential. I think because the question has come up so in many ways about those whose voice or whose experience or whose reason has been bracketed out, left out, not included. It could be groups, it could be civilizations, it could be any of those things which are excluded. What do you do with that? And I think what happens really is that I think when he's bringing in the notion of other and saying why you will always need to have that kind of engagement is what you need not be conditioned by their recognition. So you should not be a slave to seeking their recognition, but you should nevertheless realize that there is this relationship which you can alter by not seeking that kind of recognition. Maybe the terms of those recognition will be entirely different. They could be, I don't want to say self-referential, but self could be a collective. It need not be an individual. It could be a collective thing that you could be talking about. So there are many, many ways in which we might think in terms of how do we carry forward and push our thinking beyond the parameters, and I think that's the message I take from him, beyond that which is already given and appears to be settled already by one configuration or another. And I think that's where this element, power of course is always at play, but we seek the universalizable only because if you're going to be only directed by who has the authority, then you have already conceded your power to somebody else, and you have to claim that back. You need to really push them into recognizing something which is, as it were, going beyond what has already been authoritatively claimed. So I think there is a lot more that could be said and one would think about, but as you said, we should not treat this as closure, because closure is what is limiting, and he has left us with many ideas to go back to think about, both at the level of our own work, our own actions, the way we think, methodological and epistemological issues, fundamental issues of what means to be a scholar and an intellectual, and who needs whom. So, but my pleasant duty now to thank Professor Guru, to all of you for having this engaging conversation with him and making us hear all these different perspectives from which we should be thinking about issues of this kind, and to JNU Academic for making it all possible. So thank you very much.